Hi, I'm David Maldo, your virtual presenter course instructor, and in this lesson we're going to learn about transitions. We can use this to make things fade on and off of our screens, as well as to make things a little more interesting and impactful when switching between different scenes. For this episode, we're really assuming you've been following along, and at this point you should have two scenes set up. If not, please go back now a few episodes and get caught up. Okay, so assuming we're all caught up, let's continue where we left off. So at this point in the course, we should have two scenes created, and each scene should have three elements: a background image. Remember, we can click the eyeball icon to show it or hide it, our camera, and some sort of smaller image. I'm using my logo for the example. For this scene, I have an office background, and for the second scene, I have this library background. And again, I can show or hide the background, my camera, and the small logo. Now, as you're following along, use whatever images you like for your backgrounds. It doesn't have to be a library and an office. Just make sure they look different so that as we're switching back and forth between them to work on our transitions, it'll be obvious to you. So let's take a look at our scene transitions doc. And if you don't see it on your interface, remember you can go to View, Docs, and just make sure it's selected. That should bring it back up. So let's take a look at ours right now. By default, it's set at fade with a 300 millisecond duration. 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. So this is pretty quick. As I switch between them, you can see there's a fade, but it's pretty quick. Just so that we could see it more obviously, let me make it 2 seconds. So 2,000 milliseconds. Now when I switch between them, it should take 2 seconds to do the fade. Okay, now you could really tell the difference. So let's look in this drop-down box to see what our other options are. By default, we have two options: cut and fade. Cut is basically no transition. It just goes directly from one to the other. It's a pretty dramatic transition. And you can see there's no settings for a cut. There's no duration. There's nothing. When you cut, you just cut. So looking at our options, other than cut and fade, we can add some other transition types if we want to. We can add a swipe, a slide, a stinger, fade to color, or a Luma wipe. There are also third-party add-ons, plugins that you can get for OBS that create even more transition types. But before we start creating some of these fun additional types, let's spend a few more minutes on fade, because there are some really powerful things you can do with fade that you just can't do with the other transitions. So let's stay with fade for a moment. Now, as I've shown you several times, fade is exactly as you would expect. We have a 2-second fade, and everything on the screen changes as I switch between scenes. But if used correctly, you can use fade to make individual things on your screen fade in and out. Let me show you how that's done. Let's say I want to make this logo fade in and out. There's just no way to do it under sources. None of the controls will do that. I can hide it and I can show it. But what I can do is I can right-click this scene and create a duplicate of this entire scene and call it Office No Logo. Now, in my Office No Logo scene, and be careful when you're working with scenes and sources, make sure you know what scene you're in, I'm going to delete the source, the logo source. So it's gone. Now look at what happens when I switch between my Office scene and the Office No Logo scene. Since the other elements of the scene are in the same place, my webcam is in exactly the same place, the background is in exactly the same place, you don't see the fade. The only fade is the one thing that's different. And this works with every source in the scene. I can make myself disappear. Same process. Going to right-click on Office, duplicate. We're going to call this Office. Call it Office No David. Let's call it Office No Camera. And again, make sure you're paying attention to which scene you're deleting sources from. Be careful. I'm in my Office No Camera scene, and I'm going to delete main camera. So now when I switch to the Office scene, I fade in. And when I switch to Office No Camera, I fade out. You can use the same concept to move things around. Let's say I want to move the logo to the other side of the screen. Again, let's duplicate our source, and we'll call this logo left since we're moving it to the left side of the screen. And in my office logo left scene, I'm going to unlock this source. Remember from our earlier lesson, unlocking gives us our red line so we can control things, and move it to the left. I don't really like it there, but just for the lesson, let's leave it there. Now when I go to my office scene, it fades from one side to the other and fades back. Most of you will probably find that cut and fade does the job for you. But as long as we're here, let's look at some of the other transitions that are available. There's too many to show them all, but we can take a look at a few. Just to show how to create one, the first one on the list is swipe. Let's add a swipe. We'll name it swipe, very creative. And let me move this window over to the side so we can see what we're doing. So there's a preview transition button, and as you would expect, it does a swipe. And if we change the direction from left to up, it swipes up. And while this is up, we can go to our actual scenes and see how it works. As we expected, swipe up does swipe up. And now when we look in our list, we see the one that we added, swipe, is there. We could have actually named it swipe up, and we could have another one called swipe down if we wanted to. So let's try another one. Let's add Luma Wipe. Again, creatively, we'll name it Luma Wipe. And Luma Wipes have a lot of options. If we click this drop-down box, we could see there are many different types. And again, you can just select one and preview it to see what happens, and also do it in your live window to see how it works. Let's grab another one. Spiral. As you would expect, it makes a little spiral. So you get the idea. There's plenty of options and lots of fun things. While going into every single option in the transitions is beyond the scope of this course, we recommend you play around with it. Find the transitions that work with your personal presentation style. So one final note on transitions, you can set individual transitions for specific scenes. Let me show you what I mean. Let's set our default back to our 2-second fade. So if I click on any of my scenes, it does my 2-second fade. But let's say we decide for the library we don't want to do that. We want to use one of our other transitions. So if I right click on library in my scenes and go to transition override, we see our 4 transitions. There's the cut and the fade that were there by default, and the swipe and the Luma Wipe that we created. So let's say we want this one to be the Luma Wipe. Now when I go to the office, it should still use my default 2-second fade. Going to office no camera should do the same thing. Go back to the office, but now when we go to the library, it should, instead of the default transition, use the one we specifically selected for this scene. Going back to the office, again, uses our default. I know this was a long lesson. Congrats for sticking through it, but this is one of the most important ones. It's one thing to put all your assets up on the screen. It's another thing to be able to move them around and control them the way you want them. If you get good at transitions, you will really be a master virtual presenter. So we're nearing the end of the main part of our course. Let's go on to the next lesson.